Good afternoon. My name is Butch Bateman. I'm on the board of directors of the Heritage Museum of Montgomery County. Today is Tuesday, August 27th, 2011, and we're very honored today to have Dr. Walter Wally Wilkerson join us to talk about his life and growing up in his business in Montgomery County. Wally, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here.
It is indeed. It is good to be here, isn't it?
Yes, it sure is.
It is.
Yeah. Talk about one of our favorite places.
That's right. We're very blessed to live in the city of Conroe, in the county of Montgomery, in the state of Texas. There's no doubt about it.
Right.
We'll start. Wally, tell us where you came from. Give us a little bit of background on your folks, and how did you wind up in Conroe, Texas? And you can just, I'll interrupt every once in a while if I need to, but you can just tell us a little bit about your life. We'll talk a bit about, obviously, how things were as far as medical, roads. I'll intervene in some of that, but tell us how you got here.
Well, I was born on June 7, 1930. My parents were Walter Wilkerson Sr., and my mother's name was Frances Burnett Wilkerson. My mother grew up in a little town called Calvert, and she was one of 9 children. There were 8 daughters and 1 son, and her father was called Judge Burnett in the Calvert area, not because he was a legal judge, but because he was a mayor and probably the best known person in the little community of Calvert, which at that time was primarily prospered on being a cotton place. There were cotton gins all over Robertson County and plantations on the Brazos River bottom, and so my mother grew up in an era that probably many of us would like to hear about, but we wouldn't care maybe to live during that time. My father was actually from Dallas area. He grew up in Rockwall, Texas. His father was in the fish hatchery business, and he actually was responsible for spawning a lot of the fish that ended up in the lakes and rivers around the state of Texas. But my father was one of 5 children. There were 3 boys and 2 girls, and they all excelled in school activities, and they all went to college. My father went to North Texas and to Baylor University, and he was a football player and a baseball player. And his claim to fame is that he was on the 1924 Southwest Conference baseball champions at Baylor. But other than that, I guess that's about the end of his sports career. But he always had an interest in teaching, and he first began teaching school in Calvert, and he did a little football coaching as well, and that's where he met my mother, in Calvert. And then he ultimately got his degree, and his first job as school superintendent was in a little town just south of Reagan, south of Marlin, called Reagan, Texas, which now is just a little, stopping on alongside the road. But he spent a number of years there in Reagan, and then he went to Calvert, and he was superintendent of schools in Calvert, Texas, and that's where I was actually born in Marlin, because there was no hospital or anything in Calvert in those days. So I grew up in Calvert, and have great memories of a small community like that. I still remember Saturday afternoon, the only picture show in Calvert, Texas, still there, but now an antique store. We would all go to the movies on Saturday and see the westerns or Shirley Temple. We saw a lot of.
You call what it cost?
Probably a nickel. I don't recall really what. Probably we got in free. I don't know. But one of the interesting things was that after the movie, we would all go home Most of my cousins live there in Calvert. We'd all go home and saddle our horses up and replay the movie, so to speak. It was really a great place to grow up, and I remember very vividly that Gulf States had a place there in Calvert, and they had a big ice making unit there, and they would make these great big 100-pound blocks of ice because nobody had electric refrigerator, you know. They had to have blocks of ice to put in
The
the
utility company,
yeah.
Gulf States Electric.
Right, Gulf States Electric was in Calvert. And I remember as a kid, the Gulf States allowed all the people in Calvert in the summertime to buy their watermelons, and they would carve their initials in the watermelon, and then they'd take it to the Gulf States and they would put it in there, and it would be ice cold. And I remember as a kid going to the Gulf States and getting the watermelons, and we'd be in the back seat, 3 or 4 of my cousins, and we each had a watermelon and put our bare feet on it. It was really cold.
I bet you that was a treat.
And watermelon was a great treat in the summertime.
You didn't have electricity?
Oh, yeah.
You had electricity at that time?
Right. Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. And then in 1938, my father got a job as superintendent of schools in Bryan. That was quite a promotion for him. Bryan was a much, much bigger town than Calvert was. So in the middle of my 2nd grade, I moved to Bryan. And I graduated from high school in Bryan in 1947. And because my father had gone to Baylor University, and I knew nothing much about it, I'd never been there, I decided, well, that's probably where I should go to college. And so I went there 1 year, and everything was nice, but I was not quite ready for the real world, I suppose, because I didn't think people at Baylor would drink beer.
Those here, they didn't drink or dance.
But my roommates were pretty busy playing and not much with the schoolwork, and I used to say they were running play with BBA because I was a pre-med student. And a lot of people say, well, when did you decide you want to be a doctor? And I said, I remember during the summer, during the polio epidemics, I thought doctors never got sick. So that's why I wanted to be a doctor. So I figured if you were a doctor, you never
got sick. Right.
It wasn't quite true.
Wasn't quite true, exactly.
But after a year at Baylor, I decided that I wanted to go somewhere else, and so I transferred to Texas A&M, and I probably went back on the word that I would never go to Texas A&M because none of the high school boys liked the Aggies because they all dated the high school girls. Because at that time A&M was an all boys.
That's right. That's right.
100%. But I did. I transferred to A&M, and it was a great choice. I got a great education, and they had a tradition there of never having a student fail to get in medical school. And so I went to medical school and graduated from A&M in 1951 with a bachelor's of science.
Were you in the Corps?
I was in the Corps. It was compulsory.
Sure.
You had to be in the Corps. And I guess at the time, like a lot of your people that have been in the service, you start out not being very happy, but then you learn a lot, and it gives you a background that paid off in later life. And so I'm proud to have been in the Corps at A&M. But I went to medical school, Southwestern Medical School in Dallas. And I was there from 1952 through 1955 when I graduated with an MD degree. And in my senior year, I went back to Bryan to visit some of my friends, and they said, well, let's go dancing. And I said, well, I don't have a date. And they said, well, you know, we'll call Nettie Jane Bullock, and I bet she probably is not busy and she'll probably go. And I said, fine, because we went to junior high school together, went to high school together, but never dated. And so we went out and we had a good time, and one thing led to another. And so in the middle of my senior year in medical school, we decided that we would get married. We got married in December of 1954. And she taught school. And then we went on my graduation, got an internship at the VA hospital in Houston. And the main reason was that my wife made a mistake of getting pregnant, and that meant that she was no longer going to be able to teach school, and so I had to find a place that paid the most money.
You had to get a more
And
pay
so
job.
the stipend for an intern at the VA hospital was $95 a month. And so with a little help, or a lot of help from our parents, we moved to Houston, and I spent a year in Houston doing an internship. It was a great experience. Part of my training was at the old Jeff Davis Hospital in Houston, which nowadays you would not even consider it being a hospital, the way things were in
That
those
was
days.
the public hospital at the time.
Oh yes, it was like at Ben Taub is now. Ben Taub was a successor to Jeff Davis Hospital, located out on Allen Parkway. And it was an experience, delivering babies and working in the emergency room, and it was quite a harrowing experience, but I had learned a lot. And but at that time, the doctor draft was still in effect, which meant that the service had the ability to call you up for 2 years, whether you just finished medical school or whether you'd been in practice for 10 years.
Even though the World War II was over.
That's correct. And Dr. Emil Carroll got called out of his practice into the service. Well, having been in the ROTC and worked at the VA hospital, I got to talking to some of the doctors there in the VA, and they said, well, you know, what you ought to do is just go ahead and go in the service, get your 2 years done, you get your foot on your feet financially, and then you'll be ready to, when you get out after 2 years, and go into practice. So they said, now, we recommend that if you want to go in a specific branch of the service, don't put that one first, because they gave you a choice, Army, Navy, or Air Force. And it was first, second, and third choice. So I wanted to go in the Air Force, so I thought, well, I'll put that my third choice. And I put the Army first and the Navy second, and I got the Navy.
Sure enough, you got the Navy.
And after I reported to the Navy in Oakland, California, I received an assignment at the Miramar Naval Air Station, located just north of San Diego, California. And the Miramar Naval Air Station was the final training place for pilots before they went aboard carriers. Right. And so I was a general medical officer, a lieutenant in the medical corps for 2 years. I spent 18 months of that at Miramar Naval Air Station, and entering into my last 6 months, I was beginning to get eager to get out and to go into practice. And one day the senior medical officer said, you need to report to the commanding officer. And I thought, well, Captain, have I done something wrong? And he said, no, the commanding officer wants to see you. So I went, reported to the commanding officer, and he said, congratulations, Doctor. You have been assigned to go aboard a ship, and you're going to be sailing to the Southwest Pacific at Inuiatak Atoll, where you're going to participate in the atomic weapons test. And I said, well, when do I have to report? He said, you have 5 days.
Oh,
I went home and told my wife, and of course, there were some tears shed over that. I had a daughter who was about 18 months old, and So I went down to, the next day to the San Diego Harbor to go aboard my ship and find out just what the lay of the land was. And I met the chief corpsman who had served in World War II. And this ship had only traveled between San Diego and Longshore. That's about 90 miles.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, we're going to be going to the Southwest Pacific. That's several thousand miles. We need to know what kind of medicines we have on board and all of that. And he said, well, I'll do an inventory. And the next day he started telling me about what he had. Most everything he had was still there from World War II. And so as quickly as we could, we requisitioned medicines and other things that we thought we need, because I really was concerned that I would get caught between two sites and we wouldn't be able to go back either way or go forward. And so I was going to be responsible for taking care of somebody that might have had a life-threatening problem.
How many people on the ship?
It was about 500. And it was an auxiliary repair ship that was on an old Liberty hull, C3 hull,
Yep.
I call it. And it was a cargo ship in the Second World War. And whereas you see your major battleships cut through the water, they were built with big things, and so the bow was built like that, and you didn't cut through there, you kind of went over the waves like that, and that's the way that they went. I remember on the way out to Pearl Harbor was our first stop, and we had a dentist on board, which was comforting, and so he and I managed to become good friends. And but I had sick call in the morning and sick call in the afternoon. It took about maybe 30, 45 minutes, and the rest of the time was just nothing to do. So I took up bridge playing. And when I got out of the Navy, my wife wanted to join a bridge club. I said, I played bridge more than I ever want to play again in my whole life. It's a great game, but I was not too anxious to play bridge again.
How young a man were you at that point?
Well, that was in 1956, so
Okay.
I was 26 years old.
26 years old.
Mm-hmm. And I remember on the way to Pearl Harbor, we ran into a squall, a storm, and every evening in the doctor's mess, we would get a report from the executive officer who would shoot the stars, get our position, and tell us how many miles we traveled. And he came in that night, and somebody said, well, Lieutenant, how many miles did we make today? And he said, we lost 26. We didn't make it. It took us 10 days to get to Pearl Harbor. We got liberty at Pearl Harbor, so we had a nice time. Then the boat sailed to Inuitak Atoll, which was in part of the atolls out there, Bikini Atoll and all, and it was one of the major battles during World War II, but it had the largest lagoon in the Pacific, and at one time the whole Pacific fleet was anchored in the lagoon at Inuitak. But this was called Operation Hardtack, and this was the last atomic weapons test performed by the United States. And I had been present in at least 12 or 15 atomic explosions, and within about 6 miles of it. We exploded atomic weapons under the water, above the water, on the ground, and about every way you can explode an atomic weapon. It was an experience that you'll never forget when you see that. So, and then when my tour of duty was over, we sailed back to San Diego, and I was checked out of the Navy, and we drove back from San Diego to Conroe, making headquarters with my parents. At that time, my father was still here, and so we kind of made a hotel out of my parents' home while I looked around to see where I might want to set up a practice. And my father said, go ahead and look around, but before you make up your mind, I want you to meet Dr. Sadler. Dr. Sadler was on the school board. And I said, okay. So we looked around and didn't really see anything that really excited either one of us. So I called Dr. Sadler and he said, great, said, I'll come by and pick you up and we'll go have lunch and we'll talk. So he came by and he said, well, we're not going to get to have lunch because I got to go to the hospital to deliver a baby. So we went to that time, the county hospital.
On First Street.
On First Street.
Right.
And that was the first time I'd been in the hospital. And we went up to the delivery area and changed clothes and got in our scrub suits and we went in and while we were waiting for the delivery, we talked business. And so after we got to deliver the baby, we came out to change clothes and Dr. Sadler, I don't remember exactly what he said, but he said, what do you think? And I said, well, if you'll have me, I want to come aboard. And he said, so got his hand, we shook hands and we never signed a contract, we never had anything in writing. It was just a handshake.
Was that just to be partners together in a clinic?
Right.
Okay, that was obviously before. You tell us a little bit about how the
Well, at that
clinic.
time, Dr. Sadler had opened his clinic in 1951 on Avenue G and Crook Street. And that was about 1 block west of the hospital. And in 1954, he invited Dr. Irving Watson to join him. And then in 1958, when I came to Conroe, it was when I joined up with the Sadler Clinic. So it was a 3-man clinic. And
Was that unusual during that time for 3 doctors to be?
No, the Family Holiday Clinic had been in business for a long time, and it was a major delivery of healthcare in the county for years. And most of the doctors that ultimately went out on their own, Dr. Hutchins, Dr. Bell, Dr. Sadler, all started in the Family Holiday Clinic. And Dr. Sadler learned some lessons from that experience, not necessarily medical, but business. And he spent a lot of time trying to convince Dr. Holland, who was a real fine man, that they needed to share the proceeds of the business a little bit more liberally with the young doctors who were doing most all the work. And Dr. Holland, for whatever reason, didn't see fit to do that. So Dr. Sadler was the first one that left. And it's kind of interesting because the lab technician in the Family Holiday Clinic was a lady named Ruth Moore. And Ruth's husband, Don, worked for the Humble Oil and Refining Company. And they made a pretty good living, and they managed to save some money. And so Ruth and Dr. Sadler got along wonderfully in their practice and worked together. And so she said, well, I want to go with you. And Dr. Sadler said, well, I'm going over to the bank to get a loan so we can set up this clinic. And he went, and Dr. Holland said, you'll never get a loan for this bank. And so he went back and he talked to Ruth Moore, and she said, well, we have some money and we'll loan you the money. And she did. And so he went and built the clinic.
Where was that located?
On Avenue G and Crook Street.
Okay, same. Okay.
Same, Avenue G and Crook Street. The building is no longer there. When we moved out of there, Dr. Sadler later gave it to the city for use for whatever they want to use it for. But then later they tore it down, so there's nothing but a vacant lot there now.
They built that right after you joined the practice.
No,
right?
he built it
58.
in 1952.
Oh, did he? Okay.
Yes, so he built it for 3 doctors, and so when I came, previously when when I came, before I came, he had hired Bill Hurst. And Bill Hurst worked for Dr. Sadler for about a year, and he just preferred to be on his own, and it was a friendly separation, and so I took Dr. Hurst's office, and so the three of us worked together. It was a great partnership, and each of us had different types of personality, but we all meshed, and we all brought something to the table. And but I can't say enough about Dr. Sadler. He was as fine a physician and a man as I ever hoped to meet. He was not only a businessman, he could have been a CEO for a business, but he was a great physician, and he had a vision that he used to talk to Dr. Watson and I about some days after a long day in practice. And the vision was that we would build a multi-specialty clinic which would have all different kinds of doctors, general practitioners, internists, pediatricians, surgeons, orthopedists, every specialty that he could get. And he would build this clinic attached to a hospital. And this was his dream. And of course, at that time, 1960, 61, the population in Montgomery County was 22,000 people. He talked to all kinds of construction people, and nobody wanted to go on the hook for a building in Conroe at that time. But he never ceased to work at it. And we started bringing in other doctors. We had several other doctors that came into the clinic. One of them was Maple Avery, who recently passed away. And Dr. Avery was with the clinic for a while. Dr. Sadler finally decided that he wasn't going to be able to sell the hospital part of it, but he could manage to do something about the clinic. So he bought property out on 105 West, across from where the Conroe High School is. And he began to make plans to build a clinic that would house 8 physicians. And in 1969, we moved from the old building to 3205 West Davis.
Must have been exciting times.
It was an exciting time.
A little fear.
Oh yes, a little trepidation about it. And remember Dr. Sadler, one time we were talking about how what a business person he was, and Becky, his wife, was told the story that she, during the construction of the new clinic building, she said, Dean, what happened to the money that I inherited from my parents? And she said, he grinned and said, it's in the electrical works of the clinic. And she said, okay, that's all she wanted to know.
He had invested his own money into the clinic.
You're right. And so it was a successful venture. In 1974, there was a large hospital organization that saw fit to help build a hospital, and we built a doctor's hospital attached to the clinic in 1974, and there was an addition to it in 1979. And the hospital part of it still stands there. But one day, many years ago, my nurse called me and said, a former nurse, and said, Dr. Wilkerson, do you know they're bulldozing down the old clinic? I said, you're kidding. I said, no. And I got in my car and I drove out there. And I stood there, and it was really kind of sad. I saw them bulldozing down the clinic, and I just couldn't resist. I picked up 6 or 8 bricks.
All right.
And took the bricks home with me. And later, they took 2 of the bricks, and they made a little deal for Dr. Sadler that he put on his desk for many years. But in later, when the hospital district built the present hospital, the Conroe Regional Medical Center, it was bought out by the same hospital operating company that owned our hospital, and it didn't make sense for them to be operating two hospitals. So they closed Doctors Hospital in 1996, and the clinic moved to the Conroe Regional Medical Center campus. And that's where they've been, and except now they have satellite operations all over the county. And when their lease came up recently to renew their lease in the hospital building, they found that they could build one cheaper than the lease, and so they're now constructing a three-story building there on the South Loop that will house the Sadler Clinic, the main building.
Okay. Plus they have the satellites on Neat Line and in the Woodlands.
We have two in the Woodlands. We have one out at Montgomery and one at League Line. Right.
Yeah.
If he could be alive, he would be very proud.
I'm sure he would be.
Yes. Dr. Watson is deceased, and so I was getting ready to tell you earlier, 5 or 6 years ago, Frankie Alexander, who headed up leadership Montgomery County, called me and said they were adding to the curriculum medical care, and they wanted some doctor who had seen the medical care grow in the county to come speak to the group about it. And I said, well, you need to talk to Dr. Sadler. He knows more than anybody. And she said, well, I did. And he said to talk to you. And I said, well, okay. So I took my legal pad and went over to Dr. Sadler's house, spent 2 or 3 hours there, wrote down a lot of information. A lot of it I knew, but a lot of it I didn't. And came up with this little presentation, which I thought nobody would be particularly interested in, but I was very happy to do it. But as it turned out, there was a tremendous interest in it, and I'm told by the people in the leadership in Montgomery County that that's always voted the #1 presentation.
Good.
And it is of interest to people to know really where medicine was and where it is now.
As they say, it's come a long way, hasn't it?
Yes, it's come a long way.
The technology.
When we had no such thing as a cell phone or a pager or anything like that, and I tell the story about, of course, Doc Sadler was a big golfer, and he played golf every weekend, and Dr. Sadler had a lot of experience in surgery. He was in the Army and was in one of the first MASH top hospitals, field hospitals in the Army during the Second World War in Europe. And I often ask him why he ever came to Conroe, and I never did really get an answer, but in 1946, he got on the train in Little Rock, Arkansas, where he grew up and went to medical school, and he rode the train to Conroe, which you could do back in those days,
Yep.
and set up his practice here in Conroe in the Falvey Holland Clinic. And Becky, his wife, didn't come until later, and they rented a little house over on Avenue A, right next to the railroad track. And she used to say, complain to Dr. Sadler about it because when it did rain, back in those days, it hadn't rained lately.
That's right.
She complained that it kept her awake at night because the rain made all the noise, on the tin roof.
That's right. That's right.
That back which we had in the
That's
galvanized roof we had back in
Let me stop 1 second and talk just a little bit about your family. You
Sure.
stayed here, you had a daughter early. Where are your children? Where are you? I asked her that because some people I've interviewed, they forget to talk about their children, and then they get all upset. They call back and they say,
I'm glad I don't want to get too long-winded here.
no, that's okay. Tell us where you
No, my wife and I, Nettie Jane, have 2 children. We have a daughter, Nancy, who is married and lives in Houston.
Good.
And they have 2 daughters. And my son, who's my youngest, Mark, is an ophthalmologist, and he practiced in the Sadler Clinic. in one of the
Good.
buildings in the Woodlands. And he has 2 children. Oldest is Elizabeth, and a younger son, Jacob.
Excellent.
And Elizabeth just graduated from Dartmouth College back this past summer.
Wow.
And she's working in New York City for assistant district attorney. I think she's going to be a lawyer. My grandson is a junior to be at Texas A&M, and he's going to be a doctor. And the other, my daughter's 2 children, one of them's in high school and one's still in junior high, so they've got a way to go.
They do.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good. We always want to make sure that the kids and grandkids get mentioned.
Right.
Otherwise, when you go back and they watch this, you'd be in trouble.
Well, I mean, I want to watch it. They've heard all these stories before.
So you practiced in Conroe for, I've calculated, like 30 plus years?
Yes, almost 40 years.
Almost 40 years?
Right.
And the
I
changes you
retired
saw in the hospital and then
Yeah.
Conroe itself when you first got here over 40 years ago?
Yes, I retired in 1995.
Okay.
Yeah, I was saying, the communications during the early time that I was here in Conroe, if you wanted to go to the picture show, you would call the hospital and say, I'm going to the picture show, I'll be on the back row, and then you would go to the ticket and can say, if the hospital calls, I'll be on the back row.
That was how you got paid?
They would come get you, and frequently did. And Dr. Sadler would play golf, and if we needed him on the weekend, the Hofferts, who managed the golf course at that time, they would know what hole he was on. Mm-hmm. And they would go pick him up, and he would come to the hospital. And there weren't a lot of antibiotics. There weren't a lot of other things. When I came to Conroe, there were only about 2 x-ray machines in the whole county. The hospital had one and we had one. We had no full-time radiologists in the county. All were general practitioners. If somebody broke their arm or broke their leg, they didn't drive to Houston. They came to the clinic and we took care of them the best we could. Yeah. It was a great experience, but it's kind of scary when I look back on it. For what I know now and what I had to use in those days, it was pretty scary. Yeah. But even in that time, for some reason, the quality of medical care in Montgomery County was always a step ahead of the other counties surrounding us. And Dr. Sadler had patients come from Huntsville, New Waverly, from Cleveland, Dayton, all over the area. And the clinic became a real popular place for people outside the county. And we had great physicians. Dr. Henry Bell was a wonderful, Melvin Hutchins. Bill Hurst was a great guy. And we all got along real well. It was only 8 of us, so we had to
That's right.
had to get along pretty good. But in time, the clinic decided that we needed a hospital, and that was kind of a tough thing for some of the doctors to realize. And then, of course, the hospital district built them a nice hospital, and so we had 2 real good hospitals in the county. And Dr. Sadler would never dream that we would have Herman Memorial in St. Luke's.
That's right.
In the county.
That's right.
And we have 3 great hospitals, and the quality of medical care in this county is very, very high. Yeah. And you don't, we still people still go to Houston because there are a lot of things that are good about Houston. But I used to say their oxygen is not any better than we have here.
That's a good one. But if you look at the greater Harris County, there's probably, what little I know, the medical facilities in Montgomery County far exceed people in Katy, Galveston. You look on east, south, and west, it's the northern part, but we've experienced some of the best medical care you can get.
Right. Well, we did that in spite of the fact, and this is a couple of things we'll talk about here that people at leadership in Montgomery County are astounded about, and we have no blood bank in Montgomery County. If people needed blood, we had to depend on people in the county coming to the hospital and donating. And Lavera Kelly, is, bless her heart, was with the Red Cross. And they had a blood mobile that came to Conroe, and she had kept a list of the donors, obviously. And so if we had a need for blood, no matter what time of day or night or what day of the week, we would call Mrs. Kelly. And Mrs. Kelly would get on the phone and she would call a donor, and people would just start showing up. And they would come to the emergency room and they would draw the blood, and as soon as they could get it matched and make sure it was okay, we'd give it.
That was it.
It was, one time I remember Dr. Watson had a lady that was hemorrhaging and had a baby, and we couldn't get the bleeding under control, and she needed a blood transfusion, and they were calling people in, and I said, well, what is her blood type? And the lab technician said, A positive. And I said, well, I'm A positive. And I said, he said, well, will you give a pint? I said, I sure will. And I got up on the table, and they took a pint of blood. I got up, he matched it, he handed me the pint of blood, and I ran up the stairs to the second floor to give this lady the pint of blood.
Here's some good stuff.
Yeah, right. And so we had a great lab technician, the Alfords, with a family. Both wives worked in the lab day and night, and he had up-to-date equipment. Any kind of blood tests that you could get in Houston, we could do here. So the hospital was rather antiquated, but the personnel and the lab facilities were great, and eventually we got a radiologist to come out of Houston and read our x-rays and do you know, the type of x-ray procedures that we do. But we didn't have the scans and all that sort of thing in those days.
Well, as you have seen, there's been a lot of people that have come out of Houston to come live in Montgomery County.
That's exactly right.
Over the last 25, 30 years.
Right. I had the pleasure of having medical students work with me out of Houston, and they would come spend 6 weeks or 8 weeks with me and learn a little bit about office practice. Mm-hmm. And it was a great thrill for me, and one of the things that I remember very fondly. And even today, occasionally somebody will see me and they'll say, well, I go to Dr. So-and-so, and said he remembers you here in Conroe. And one of them one time asked me, did you ever see a miracle? Or were you ever around a miracle in medicine? And I said, yes. And so I told this story, and I tell it to the leadership in Montgomery County. Back in the early 60s, there was no such thing as a defibrillator. If someone's heart stopped beating, even CPR was not even known of in that day. But in the early 60s, some doctors back east started thinking, well, maybe we can do what we call an open massage. And it means you would open the chest, put your hand in there, and squeeze the heart until it would start beating again. And so, being a young doctor, I'd read all that, and it sounded pretty dramatic, and I thought, well, that'll never happen, I'm sure. But one weekend, a young 20-year-old, 25, 26-year-old healthy guy came in the emergency room of the old hospital, and no doubt he had appendicitis. Dr. Sadler was on the golf course, and so had to have an assistant. So we called, and they got Dr. Sadler to come in, and we successfully removed the appendix, and we were sewing the wound up, and the nurse anesthetist said, I can't get a pulse. And Dr. Sadler and I looked at each other, and I'm sure we both turned white. We both started feeling for a pulse, and there was none. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I picked a knife up. I'd never opened a chest before in my life. And I zipped it open, and Dr. Sadler held the ribs apart, and I put my hand in the chest, and I started squeezing this kid's heart. And I said a lot of praying, did a lot of praying at the same time. And it seemed like an eternity, but suddenly the nurse anesthetist said, I can get a pulse, and I can get a blood pressure. And so we took my hand out, and we stood there for a while. Blood pressure was good. The pulse rate was good.
That's a miracle.
And that was a miracle. We closed the chest and went out and talked to the man's wife and told her we didn't know how well he would do. It's a major operation. He had 2 operations. He came in to get one. And 5 days later, this guy got up and walked out of the hospital. So that's my miracle.
That's your miracle. That's your miracle. You've talked a little bit about your medical career. We know that you had a different career, that you had a little hobby that you started becoming involved in local politics.
Right.
I know that there's been many awards that you've done here for the medical profession, and I'm going to get you to talk about those as we close. But tell us a little bit about your interest in Montgomery County politics, please, sir.
Well, you know, I've thought a lot about that, why I ever got interested in politics. I've never been able to answer, but as I came in the building, I noticed the memorial there for Jim Webster. And when I moved, he and I moved to Conroe about the same time. As you know, Jim Webster worked for the Texas Forest Service. And one Saturday or one Friday, Jim called me. We had met at Methodist Church and had become friends. And he called me and he said, Wally, the Chamber of Commerce is putting on a political action seminar. Let's go. And I said, well, okay. You know, I never had any
play golf?
No, I didn't play golf. I tried, but I gave that up early.
Couldn't keep up with Dean.
So we went, and this was in 1960, 1961, no, 1960, and from that, both of our interest in politics has sort of stemmed. And we both worked in a campaign for a Democrat congressman named John Dowdy, who was from Athens, Texas, but he represented Montgomery County in the second, I believe it was the 2nd Congressional District of Texas at the time. And he had a Democrat opponent, and so we campaigned in Montgomery County, and then again in 1962. And I went to a number of Democrat events and functions, and in 1962, after the primary, I thought, I don't believe I belong there. Not that there was anything wrong, I just didn't feel comfortable.
In that era, the county was 100% Democratic.
Yes, it was all Democrat. And there was a few Republicans that I'd met, very few. And so I thought, well, I fit in better. I want to be honest with everybody, I fit in better there. So in 1962, I became a Republican, and the county chairman at that time were usually petroleum engineers that had come from the Midwest where the Republican Party was active, and they couldn't figure out. They asked, well, where can I vote Republican? And everybody would say, no, you just can't vote Republican here. So one of them decided he was going to figure out how to do it, and he did. And so he held the first primary election for the Republican Party in 1962, and they had 38 brave souls come to the, and I wasn't one of them. I was still working as a Democrat.
Voted Republican.
Voted Republican in 1962. But after the primary in 62, I got involved in the governor's race. Jack Cox was a former Democrat who was running as a Republican for governor against a gentleman named John Conley. So that was a pretty hot race.
It was.
And we did pretty good in Montgomery County, and so I decided there might be a future for Republicans. I didn't know how long it would take to be on an even keel with the Democrats, but I figured there was a chance to do it. So in '64, the petroleum engineer got transferred, and I kind of took the job on, and nobody else wanted to do it, and so I said, okay, I'll do it. And so it's like anything else. Sometimes when you're exposed to it, it kind of gets in your blood, and it was a different type of activity than I was accustomed to in medicine. And I guess instead of playing golf, I enjoyed fooling with politics.
Well, did you make a statement at one time that there was a time when you could hold the county Republican convention in a phone booth?
Well, be a small phone booth. We had in 1965, after the Goldwater election, there were 21 voting precincts in the county, and I had 6 precinct chairmen. And we had a meeting, and I said, I've learned 2 things from this election. One is there are people that tend to vote Republican, and what we need is a telephone number in the phone book, and we need a headquarters with a sign out so people will know there are Republicans here. And several of them nodded their head, and one of them said, well, why do we need a headquarters? The Democrats don't have one. And my reply was, yes, they do. It's called the county courthouse.
That's right.
And so I remember walking into R.J. Gray's office as a district clerk to get the stub boxes to hold the 1964 primary, and there was a Lyndon Johnson sign on his wall in the courthouse. And I said, Mr. Gray, this is my courthouse too. He said, I can't even spell Republican. But we later became great friends, and RJ was a great guy.
Yeah.
And I really learned to appreciate him.
So you became the chairperson in 64?
64.
64.
Right.
And are you still the chairperson?
Still am.
Still there? And here we are in the year 2011, so it's been a long tenure.
Yes, sir.
Then you,
It has.
like your medical career, you and others have been successful. And now, what is the climate of Montgomery County?
What's what?
What is the political climate?
Oh,
of
the
Montgomery
climate.
County?
Oh, well, we like to say it's the most Republican county and the most Republican state in the nation. No Democrat has been elected to a district, county, or precinct office since 1994. And no Democrat candidate for president has won this county since 1964.
1964.
We have a great organization. We have over 600 women involved in Republican women's activities. We have a very active young Republicans organization and a teenage Republican organization. So my job is really easy compared to 20 or 25 years ago. And I still love doing it. My wife says she may not vote for me if I run again, but maybe I can talk her into it.
You've been appointed to several boards, the state level, and the
Yes, sir. I've served on the Sandy Center River Authority. Governor Clements appointed me from 1990 to 1995, and Governor George W. Bush appointed me as the chairman of the State Department of Health in 1995. Mm-hmm. I've served 6 years in that capacity. So I've enjoyed it, and it's doesn't no pay to it, and it's time consuming, but you feel like you're. I tell people it's kind of like being part of a civic club or something of that sort. You're doing a civic duty when you.
Well, your contribution to your fellow citizens, no matter what your political ideology is.
Oh, I've always had great relations with my Democrat counterpart in this county, and our whole job is to make sure everybody has an opportunity to vote and cast their vote for whichever party they choose.
Exactly.
And we fortunately in 1980 after the election, Mickey Dyson was county judge. He'd been appointed. Lynn Coker resigned to take a judgeship, and I went to Mickey and I said, Mickey, we need an elections administrator in this county, somebody that spends 365 days a year working on nothing but elections, because the county clerk would appoint someone to hold the elections and maybe for 2 months, and then they'd go back to doing what they did. And so it really wasn't what it ought to be. And so the election code provided for that, and Mickey, we only had one Republican county commissioner at the time, but Mickey agreed, and he talked the commissioners into doing it, and it's been great for this county. We've had Mrs. Garner and now Mrs. Galtney, who's retired, have just done a tremendous job and making sure that our elections are open and fair and all that. So I'm proud of the election
Elections
process.
used to be, there was a trailer on the courthouse square.
Right.
And everybody would pile up in front of the trailer and they'd put the numbers up there in chalk.
Yeah, that's right. It's a difference between night and day. No more paper ballots, no more hanging chads. We didn't have that problem in this county, but.
We never had any hanging chads.
No, I don't, to my knowledge, we never did, but it's been a real thrill and a pleasure for me to serve in this capacity, and I'll always remember it fondly.
Well, on behalf of the Heritage Museum of Montgomery County, let me tell you, you're one of the visionaries. You're one of the people that came to Montgomery County, stayed in Montgomery County, and helped this county be what it is today.
Well,
that's for sure.
I would like to think I had some small part in it, but I appreciate that. My father used to tell me, whatever you do, you want to leave the facility or leave your town or your community better off than you found it.
That's right. That's right. As you look back on your life, you've seen Conroe and Montgomery County prosper and grow, and our relationship to Houston and Lake Conroe. Right. This tape will be seen by visitors in the years to come. Do you have any passing comment or something from those generations?
When I became county chairman, this was a rural county, essentially a rural county.
Lumber.
And so the lumber and agriculture and some cattle and that sort of thing. And the oil, of course, that was a big part of the county. But the county commissioners court reflected what the county was at the time. And my concern and the concern of others in the county, not just me, was that someday this county was going to start growing, and when it did, if we weren't prepared, we wouldn't have the kind of facilities and growth that we want, the kind of people that we want to move into our county. And so I tried real hard to find quality people to run for county commissioner, because at the time I first got into politics, county commissioner was known for how many potholes he could fill and how many roads he could grade and that sort of thing. People didn't give much thought to budget or taxation or anything of that sort.
The future.
And I knew all the county commissioners and I respected them all. And I'll tell briefly a little story about one of them, because he was just a great man, and I'm sure Sam remembers Mr. Doug Alley. And there wasn't a more honest man and a fair man around than Doug, but he was from a different era. And so Doug just couldn't seem to get going on the right-of-way for the South Loop. And so I thought, well, this is a political issue that maybe we can finally elect our first county commissioner, that I didn't have anything against Mr. Alley. So we got a candidate and we campaigned real hard, and we actually won one precinct, and we were just so excited about it. And on election night, we were up in the old 9th District courtroom, and they were, reporting the returns, and Mr. Alley was sitting there, and his wife was just as sweet a lady. You probably, if you didn't know her, she was really a small little lady, and Mr. Alley was a quiet person and never said very much. Anyway, the person that was running against him, when it was obvious that we were going to lose, I said, let's go over and congratulate Mr. Alley. And so we went over, and he was sitting there on the bench, and he was sound asleep. I said, he was really worried about the outcome of this election. And I did wake him up, and I said, congratulations, Mr. Alley. And he was a gentleman, and he said, oh, it was a lot of fun. You know, he never had anything but one campaign card. And on the back of it was a recipe for Mexican cornbread. Every time, that's what he had.
That's it. That was
And
just,
that was all he had. He didn't have any signs, he didn't have no bumper stickers or anything in those days, but that was one card.
yeah. Of course, Conroe and Montgomery County were a little smaller.
Right,
As my father would say, and you say, I used to know everybody.
right. Well, I think I have to say that our Commissioners Court has done a tremendous job for our county. People sometimes might have a gripe about one or the other, but they have brought our county into the 21st century. And when they're gone, and there are, Commissioner Chance is retiring, and I understand Commissioner Metter's going to retire
right.
in his next term, and we're going to lose some giants.
That's right.
But we're working hard to make sure we have good replacements.
That's right. Well, and because it will continue to grow.
Yes, our major problem now is water, and transportation. Those are the two big things that
That's
we,
right. The population of Montgomery County now is approximately,
455,000 in the last census.
and it's forecast to be in 20 years.
It's gonna be 1 million people.
Maybe.
Oh, in 20 years, probably more than 1 million, but in the next 10 years, it'll probably be 1 million.
I think based upon the legacy that you and the people that have made Montgomery County grow, that there'll be other people that step up to the plate
Oh,
and
yeah.
continue that growth for the prosperity of the
Yes,
citizens.
definitely. I don't have any doubt about it.
I don't either. I think this is a great place to live.
I agree. And so do a lot of other people.
That's right, that's right.
Yeah.
They keep coming to the piney woods of Montgomery County to
And
live.
and we want the right kind of people, and we have the greatest schools, as good schools as there is in the state.
That's right.
And so this is a great place to live.
It is indeed. Yep. I'm glad to have grown up here and moved away. Judge Barb Sadler said in his closing comments to us, he said, you know, in 1965, when you graduated, Butch, there were very few jobs.
Right.
Now, a man and a woman can leave, go to college, and come back and work and live and raise a family in Montgomery County.
Exactly right.
The possibilities.
And we're not just growing in one area, we're growing all over. As a matter of fact, we're growing rapidly in East Montgomery County.
Right.
And it's going to be changing. The complexion of that part of the county is going to be changing too.
That's right, that's right. Well, listen, on behalf of the Heritage Museum of Montgomery County, we've been talking today with Dr. Wally Wilkerson. It's been our pleasure to hear his stories and his history, and we look forward to a continued relationship with Wally.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.